If you watch this show regularly, you'll know we've spent a lot of time pointing out inaccuracies in the media where guns and silencers are concerned. Our next guest seems to be as frustrated as I am with mainstream media's reporting on guns. Her name is Ash Scow, and she reports for Watchdog.org and The Observer. What's going on, Ash?
Not much. It's a nice afternoon down here, finally getting into the 80s.
I would be pretty happy about that, at least here in Dallas, except for when it starts getting into the 80s in Dallas, that just means 106 and 110 are soon to come. So I can't really enjoy it as much as I typically should.
Right.
So tell us about your Observer article on guns and the media, because oh God, I'll let you take it just because I'm pretty sure they're sick and tired of hearing it come from me.
Right. Well, we see constantly that the media will become fixated on some issue about guns. You know, their main narrative is that all guns are evil and all gun owners are just, a breath away from becoming criminals.
Yeah.
But then they'll get fixated on these small issues. And their latest one is on suppressors, which of course they call silencers because that's what they're called in the movies. And of course the movies like James Bond, Jason Bourne, they all make it look like you can fire a gun and no one will hear it.
Yeah.
So that anybody who's firing one could just become an assassin really quickly. And it would be, this idea that it's really easy to get or make these, which is not the case. But when you actually look at what suppressors are and what they're used for and what they could be used for, you'll find that, Hollywood gets it wrong, shockingly, and then the media gets it wrong, shockingly. That suppressors actually only reduce the sound of a typical gunshot by about 30 decibels, from about 165 decibels to about 135, which is still, beyond OSHA requirements.
Yeah.
For people that work in loud places. It's about 115 is the acceptable level. So you're still above that, which means it could still hurt your hearing, and you can definitely still hear it. It makes it about as loud as a jackhammer, but then you add in, the kind of sonic boom around a bullet. That kind of adds to that. And obviously you can hear a jackhammer. So not going to be difficult to hear it even at 135 decibels, which makes it, as the NRA says, as gun rights activists say, it is a hearing protection aid. Because if you think about it, if you're in your home and you're using your constitutional right to carry and protect your family, and somebody does come into your home and you need to fire your gun, you don't have time to tell your family, hey, kids, go grab your earbuds and your hearing protection. No, if you have the suppressor, then you might not destroy your children's hearing while protecting them from an intruder.
No, absolutely. I mean, very rarely will you see, more times than not, if I'm shooting a suppressor, I still have AirPro in. There are very few times that you see me, and they're out there. There are videos out there of me shooting without any AirPro while I'm shooting a suppressor, and that's probably because I'm only shooting it a few times. Because after a certain, it's repeated exposure that causes a lot of the issue. And so for me, like you said, that sonic boom, it's not quiet. Like
right.
there's nothing quiet about the sonic boom of a round breaking the sound barrier. But we are largely contending with people, a large group of people, which is the general masses of people who don't understand firearms, who have been indoctrinated with this idea that silencers make guns silent. What I find interesting too is this hyper focus on the idea that, if you allow people to get silencers more easily, that it's going to be harder to detect gunshots and so forth and so on. And I'm like, well, if you look at a lot of the cases where there have been mass shootings, shooting stuff, most people disassociate what they hear anyway. So many times I've seen people interviewed and they're here like, I heard something, but I just thought it was this, or I thought it was that, or I thought it was this.
Right. Exactly.
Exactly.
Because other things sound like gunshots. I've mistaken, a transformer exploded once outside of my apartment building, and it sounded like a gunshot, a car backfiring. And those are things that you would hear, and people just mistake them, or they only hear it once.
Yeah.
So they think, that couldn't possibly be a gunshot. This isn't a dangerous area,
No, you're absolutely right. And so it's definitely something that, it's going to take a lot of educating of people who don't know on our part, which unfortunately is tough because we don't necessarily have the same avenues and channels to do it the way they can. They can go out and make a multi-million-dollar movie and then reinforce this idea and notion that silencers make things quiet. I just got through watching the last episode of The Walking Dead, unfortunately, and the gun accuracy in that show is just atrocious. Like, and at first it was comical, and now it's getting to the point where I'm just like, gosh, they don't even try.
Right.
And
well, it's just so many people in Hollywood and the media are inherently just opposed to guns, and so they've never shot one. I mean, I remember shortly after the 2016 election when John Ekdahl had asked question to the media, do any of you know anyone who owns a pickup truck? And I think, maybe we should ask that question. Members of the media, how many of you have fired a gun?
Yeah.
How many of you know somebody who owns a gun or know somebody who has ever fired a gun? Can you just talk to them? I mean, you see time and time again when you take these journalists that don't like guns and then they fire a gun, a lot of times there was like the one Vox writer who said that he got post-traumatic stress disorder from firing a gun. But most of the time they end up thinking, oh my God, this was amazing. I just shot this. And understanding that it's a tool and it's not inherently evil.
Yeah. And it's weird though. There's just a lack of consistency. It's like the same journalist will go into the middle of a war zone and report live from the war zone just so that they can factually get the information correct about what's going on there and have no qualms about doing it. But then ask that same journalist who's going to do a piece about firearms specifically to actually go to a range, actually try to shoot a firearm. It's like, no, I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it.
Right,
It's
exactly.
like,
they just parrot what gun control activists have said, and they don't know either. I mean, they go off of, some certain statistics, and then they usually remove all context from those statistics, like the 30,000 a year gun deaths, mostly suicides. Now, maybe some people who don't have access to a gun might not, but a lot of people that are determined to commit suicide just aren't going to be deterred by not being able to get a gun if that's what you really want to do. So, that has to be a context that's included. Or even, when they say 100,000 people are shot every year by guns. Well, again, you're banning guns. There's also how many people are stabbed, how many people were saved by other people with guns. I mean, there's context to every statistic that just gets completely removed when it comes to guns.
I did the research on that 30,000 stat because I'd been hearing it for years, right? Never really looked into it. And finally, the day that I did, I was so glad I did because I was like, holy crap. They've been basically living in this cocoon of a facade for decades. Over 60, we're not talking 60, we're not talking 50, over 60%. We're talking more like closer to like 66% of those deaths are suicides. And as you pointed out, anybody who's committed to harming themselves, not having a gun isn't going to prevent them from doing that. But the interesting thing about that is if you compare us to other countries, which they love to do so often when it comes to the issue of guns, our suicide rate compared to other countries that don't have guns as readily available as we do are par. They're on par. We're right along each other. And in some cases, in places like Japan, it's even higher. And barely anybody has access to a firearm in that country. So, but like you said, without that context, you see that stat, 30,000. And by no means would I ever belittle or to act as if suicide isn't an important issue. It's just the wrong issue to focus on with respect to dealing with the Second Amendment right. Anybody who sees that stat will look at it totally different once they found out that over 60% of those deaths were suicides. Because the stat inherently in itself tells you that America is a wasteland of killers who just run around shooting at people randomly. And it's a completely different perspective once you understand that context. And from your experience, I mean, what do you think is the biggest driver for journalists to kind of essentially get things wrong? Is it majority on purpose? Is it just sheer ignorance and laziness from a journalistic perspective? What do you think is the biggest driver of largely pushing these fallacies?
Ignorance, laziness, this commitment to what they believe must be true, right? So they believe all of these things about guns, so there's no need to fact check them, right?
Yeah.
Like we've seen that really become a problem after Trump won the election, where multiple media outlets were just throwing out stuff that's like, oh, if it's negative about Trump, it must be true because
Yeah.
Trump is horrible, right? Like that's the belief.
Yeah.
So there's no need to double check anything, and they got burned time and time again off of that. But when it comes to guns, it's so ingrained into so many millions of Americans' minds that these stats are true because they're repeated over and over and over again. And the voices that are like, look, here's the context around these statistics. That's once you have to explain something rather than just saying, oh, this number and this number. And if guns didn't exist, that wouldn't be the case. No one would be hurt in society, right? Like once you believe that, I mean, how are you?
Yeah.
Why would you ever check on that?
Nope. You're absolutely right. I'm inclined to agree with you wholeheartedly. But thank you very much, Ash, for joining us. I would love to have you back on whenever you're available.
Absolutely, it's fun.
And I look forward to seeing some other pieces that you're writing in the future.
All right.
All right, you have a good one.
You too.
We're going to take a little break, and when we come back, we'll look at how the super rich prep for doomsday.